I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who doubted her own marriage after 45 years. But here I am, sitting at our kitchen table, watching Harold read the newspaper like nothing's wrong. It was a typical morning in our little suburban home in Portland, Oregon. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting golden patterns on the wooden floors. I was sipping coffee while buttering toast, glancing occasionally at my husband, Harold Harrison. He looked peaceful, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his graying hair slightly messy from sleep, but something about him felt off. Not that Harold had ever been one for dramatic declarations or grand gestures. No, he was always more of a quiet man, steady and dependable. But lately, his silences seemed heavier than usual, as though there was something lurking beneath the surface. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. After all, we'd been through so much together. We raised 2 kids, weathered financial storms, and even survived the heartbreak of losing friends to time. Yet, deep down, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that Harold wasn't entirely present anymore. That evening, when he casually mentioned receiving an invitation to his ex-wife Maggie Dawson's 70th birthday party, my stomach dropped. "Just catching up with old friends," he said nonchalantly. But the way he avoided meeting my eyes told me otherwise. When Harold first brought up the idea of attending Maggie's party, I wanted to scream. Instead, I smiled and nodded like the supportive wife I've always been. Funny how decades of practice can make you suppress your true feelings so easily. That night, after Harold fell asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying his words over and over again. Maggie Dawson, the name alone stirred memories I'd long buried. She was everything I wasn't back then. Bold, glamorous, and effortlessly charming. When Harold married me 5 years after their divorce, I thought I'd finally won. Won his heart, won his loyalty, won our future. But now, hearing her name again made me question whether I'd really won anything at all. The next day, I mustered the courage to ask Harold why he suddenly wanted to reconnect with Maggie. "It's just nostalgia, Clara," he said, brushing me off. "We're both older now. What harm could it do?" His dismissive tone stung more than I cared to admit. Still, I relented, agreeing to let him go. What choice did I have? If I pushed too hard, it would only fuel his desire to see her. So, I packed his suitcase, kissed him goodbye, and watched him drive away, pretending I wasn't terrified of what might happen next. As Harold drove off to Seattle, memories flooded back. Memories I'd spent years trying to forget. Like the time I found an old photo of them tucked inside one of his books. Their smiles were radiant, untouchable. For weeks afterward, I wondered if I'd ever measure up. I remember the early days of our marriage vividly. Harold often spoke fondly of his youth, reminiscing about road trips and late-night conversations with Maggie. At first, I didn't mind. It was part of who he was. But over time, those stories began to feel like shadows looming over us. Once, during an argument, he snapped, "You'll never understand what we had." Those words haunted me for months. It wasn't until Sarah, our daughter, pointed out how much Harold relied on me that I started to believe maybe I had earned his love after all. Now, decades later, those doubts resurfaced with a vengeance. Why now? Why Maggie? As I tidied up the house, I stumbled upon an old scrapbook filled with faded photographs of Harold and me. There we were, young, hopeful, and blissfully unaware of the challenges ahead. Looking at those pictures reminded me of how far we'd come. But it also made me wonder, had we grown complacent? Had I stopped being the woman he fell in love with? These questions swirled in my mind as I prepared for bed, dreading the moment Harold would return, and the possibility that he might not come back alone. The call came late at night, waking me from a restless sleep. It was Linda, my best friend, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Clara," she said, "you won't believe this, but Harold proposed to Maggie at her birthday party." My heart sank like a stone into icy water. For a moment, I thought I misheard her. Harold wouldn't do something like that, not after everything we built together. But as Linda recounted the details, including how guests gasped and Maggie hesitated before accepting, reality hit me like a freight train. How could he throw away 45 years of marriage for a fleeting impulse? Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring the room around me. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and utterly powerless. When Harold returned home the following afternoon, I confronted him immediately. "Is it true?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He looked startled, then guilty. "Clara, please let me explain," he pleaded. But no amount of explaining could justify what he'd done. We argued for hours, voices rising and falling like waves crashing against rocks. By the end of it, I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and more confused than ever. Could our marriage survive this betrayal? Or was it already too late? After the fight, I retreated to the porch, clutching a cup of tea that did little to soothe my frayed nerves. Harold followed me outside, his expression a mixture of guilt and desperation. "I don't know what came over me," he admitted. Seeing Maggie again, it brought back feelings I thought were gone. His confession cut deeper than any knife. Feelings he thought were gone. What about the feelings he supposedly had for me? I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but instead, I listened silently as he poured out his heart. He talked about feeling trapped by age, by routine, by the monotony of life. Maggie, he claimed, represented freedom, a chance to recapture the excitement of his youth. But as he spoke, I realized something crucial. Harold wasn't running toward Maggie. He was running away from himself. That realization didn't make the pain any easier to bear. In fact, it made it worse. Because if Harold's proposal wasn't about Maggie at all, then what hope did we have of fixing this mess? I spent the rest of the evening pacing the house, replay years of memories in my mind. Was I truly enough for him? Or had I failed somewhere along the way without realizing it? These questions kept me awake long into the night, each one more painful than the last. The next morning, I woke up with a resolve I hadn't felt in years. If Harold thought he could throw away our life together on some reckless whim, then it was up to me to remind him, and Maggie, what they were really dealing with. I started by calling Sarah, our daughter, who had always been sharper than she let on. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. I assured her I was fine, but I needed her help. Together, we began digging into Harold's connection with Maggie. It didn't take long to uncover the first truth. Harold had kept in touch with Maggie over the years. Letters, emails, even occasional phone calls. They'd maintained a secret correspondence that spanned decades. My stomach churned as I read snippets of their exchanges, filled with nostalgia and thinly veiled affection. How could he keep this from me? The second truth came courtesy of a mutual acquaintance, a woman named Diane who lived near Maggie in Seattle. According to Diane, Maggie had recently inherited a fortune from a deceased relative. Suddenly, Harold's sudden interest in rekindling their relationship felt less romantic and more calculated. Was he drawn to her or her money? And then there was the third truth, the most unsettling of all, whispers that Maggie had orchestrated the entire reunion, using her charm and resources to lure Harold back into her orbit. Each revelation hit me, like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about love or longing. It was manipulation, plain and simple. Armed with these truths, I confronted Harold again, laying everything out on the dining room table like evidence in a courtroom. "How could you lie to me?" I demanded, my voice trembling with anger and hurt. Harold looked stunned, his face pale as he sifted through the documents. For once, he didn't try to deny it. Instead, he sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands. "Clara, I didn't mean for things to go this far," he murmured. But his apology did little to ease the storm raging inside me. How dare he play with my emotions, and Maggie's, for his own selfish reasons? His excuses rang hollow, each word chipping away at the foundation of trust we'd built over 45 years. Despite his pleas for forgiveness, I knew I couldn't let this slide. Not without a fight. That night, I called Linda and poured out my frustrations. "He's made his choice," I said bitterly, "but I'm not going down without a fight." Linda agreed, urging me to expose Maggie's schemes before it was too late. Her words ignited a spark within me, a determination to protect what was mine. If Harold wanted to destroy our marriage, I'd make sure he understood exactly what he was losing. With Linda's encouragement, I reached out to Sarah and Michael, hoping they'd stand by me in this mess. To my relief, Sarah immediately sided with me, her loyalty unwavering. "Dad's being an idiot," she said bluntly. "Let's fix this." Michael, however, was another story. When I explained the situation, he hesitated, clearly torn between his parents. "Mom, I get why you're upset, he said cautiously. But Dad's not thinking straight. Maybe he needs space to figure things out. His words stung, not because they were wrong, but because they highlighted how divided our family had become. Still, I refused to give up. With Sarah's support, I devised a plan to gather more concrete proof of Maggie's manipulations. We enlisted the help of a private investigator, a discreet professional recommended by a friend, to dig deeper into Maggie's financial dealings. Meanwhile, Maggie herself grew suspicious of my interference. She called me one evening, her tone icy. "Stay out of this, Clara," she warned. "You don't know what's best for Harold." Her arrogance infuriated me, fueling my determination even further. Who did she think she was, waltzing back into our lives after all these years? If she thought I'd roll over and let her win, she was sorely mistaken. A week later, the private investigator delivered his report, and it confirmed my worst fears. Maggie had indeed used her inheritance to orchestrate the reunion, showering Harold with gifts and attention designed to reel him in. The evidence was damning. Bank statements showing large transfers to Harold's account, receipts for expensive dinners and trips, and even text messages hinting at her ulterior motives. As I pored over the documents, a cold fury settled in my chest. Maggie wasn't just trying to win Harold back. She was playing him like a pawn in her game. The realization hardened my resolve. I wouldn't let her destroy everything Harold and I had worked so hard to build. That night, I shared the findings with Sarah, who gasped in disbelief. "This is insane," she muttered, shaking her head. "We have to stop her." Together, we devised a strategy to confront Maggie publicly, exposing her lies and forcing Harold to see the truth. It was risky, but I knew it was the only way to save our marriage, and maybe even Harold himself. As the days passed, Harold seemed increasingly conflicted. He spent hours on the phone with Maggie, their conversations soft and intimate. Listening to him laugh like that broke my heart, but it also reminded me of the man I fell in love with. There were moments when I almost gave up, when the weight of betrayal felt unbearable. But then I'd catch glimpses of the Harold I used to know, the man who held my hand during tough times, who whispered sweet nothings in my ear, who promised to love me forever. Was that man still in there, buried beneath layers of regret and fear? Or had Maggie's influence erased him completely? One evening, as I watched him gaze wistfully at an old photograph of us, I realized something important. Harold wasn't choosing Maggie, he was running away from the pain of growing old. And if I wanted to win him back, I'd have to remind him of the beauty in staying. With only 3 weeks left until the wedding, I knew time was running out. If I didn't act fast, Harold would walk down that aisle and take what remained of my heart with him. Every day felt like a ticking clock, each second bringing me closer to losing Harold forever. Armed with the evidence against Maggie, I began preparing for the ultimate showdown, the rehearsal dinner. It was the perfect opportunity to expose her schemes in front of everyone, family, friends, and even Harold himself. But as much as I wanted to believe this plan would work, doubt gnawed at me. What if Harold refused to listen? What if he chose Maggie anyway, despite knowing the truth? The thought terrified me, but I couldn't afford to hesitate now. Sarah became my partner in crime, helping me organize everything while keeping Michael distracted. "Dad's going to hate us for this," she said one evening as we reviewed the documents. "But it's better than letting him make the biggest mistake of his life." Her words echoed my own fears, but they also gave me strength. If Harold truly loved me, he'd see through Maggie's lies. And if he didn't, well, at least I could say I fought for us until the very end. The night of the rehearsal dinner arrived, and my nerves were stretched taut like piano strings. As I walked into the banquet hall, clutching the folder of evidence, I felt like I was stepping onto a battlefield. The room buzzed with laughter and chatter, guests mingling over glasses of champagne. Harold stood near the center, looking dapper in his suit, while Maggie hovered beside him, radiant in a sleek emerald dress. For a moment, I faltered. Is this really how it ends? But then I spotted Sarah across the room, giving me an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, I approached the microphone set up for speeches. "Excuse me, everyone," I began, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Silence fell as all eyes turned to me. "Before we celebrate this union, there's something you need to know." With trembling hands, I opened the folder and began reading aloud the incriminating details about Maggie's manipulations. Gasps rippled through the crowd as I revealed bank statements, emails, and texts proving her deceit. Maggie's face turned pale, then red with anger. "This is outrageous," she snapped, trying to interrupt. But I pressed on, determined to finish what I started. As I finished speaking, the room erupted into chaos. Guests whispered among themselves, some glaring at Maggie, others shooting sympathetic glances my way. But it was Harold's reaction, or lack thereof, that hit me hardest. He stood frozen, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might collapse under the weight of the revelations. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the banquet hall, leaving behind a stunned silence. Maggie stormed off in tears, shouting accusations about betrayal and sabotage. Meanwhile, I stood there, clutching the microphone, wondering if I just destroyed any chance of salvaging our marriage. Later that night, I found Harold sitting alone on a park bench overlooking the city lights. His shoulders slumped, his face etched with exhaustion. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly when I approached. "I didn't want to hurt you," I replied, my voice breaking. "But I couldn't let you throw away everything we've built either." He sighed heavily, staring off into the distance. "I don't know what I want anymore," he admitted. My heart ached hearing those words, but I knew this was his moment of reckoning, not mine. The next morning, Maggie showed up at my doorstep, her eyes blazing with fury. "You think you've won, don't you?" she spat, shoving a stack of papers into my hands. To my shock, the documents contained private details about my marriage, arguments Harold and I had years ago, financial struggles we'd faced, even embarrassing moments I'd hoped no one else knew about. Maggie smirked triumphantly. "If you think exposing me will save your marriage, think again," she sneered. "Harold already knows how imperfect your relationship is." Her words stung like venom, planting seeds of doubt in my mind. Had I been naive to think revealing her lies would be enough? But as I looked closer at the papers, something struck me. They weren't just meant to humiliate me. They were designed to manipulate Harold further. Maggie was trying to paint me as the villain, framing herself as the victim. Determined not to let her win, I called Sarah and shared the new development. "We can't let her twist the narrative," Sarah insisted. "It's time to remind everyone, including Dad, what real love looks like." That evening, Sarah and Michael cornered Harold in the living room, their expressions serious. "Dad, you need to wake up," Sarah said firmly. "Mom's been fighting for you this whole time. Can't you see that?" Michael chimed in, his tone softer but equally urgent. "We're not taking sides here, Dad. We just want you to think about what matters most. Do you really want to throw away 45 years of happiness for someone who's using you?" Their words seemed to pierce through Harold's defenses. He sat silently for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the floor. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I got lost somewhere along the way." Hearing him admit that brought tears to my eyes. Maybe there was still hope for us after all. Later that night, I joined him on the couch, neither of us saying a word. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than anything else. And in that quiet moment, I realized forgiveness wasn't just about him, it was about me too. 2 days before the wedding, I confronted Harold one last time. "Do you love her, or are you just chasing a memory?" I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. His response would determine everything. Harold hesitated, his brow furrowed as though wrestling with conflicting thoughts. "Clara," he started, then stopped. Tears welled up in his eyes. "I don't know anymore. All I know is that being with Maggie doesn't feel right, not like it used to. Not like it does with you." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. "Then prove it," I challenged. "Call off the wedding. Choose us." For a moment, he looked torn between fear and resolve. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll do it." Those 2 simple words carried the weight of 45 years of love, trust, and struggle. As he reached for my hand, I allowed myself to hope, for the first time in weeks, that we might actually survive this. When Harold announced he was canceling the wedding, the room fell silent. Maggie stared at him in disbelief, her lips trembling with rage. "You're making a mistake," she hissed before storming out, slamming the door behind her. Guests exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to applaud or leave quietly. Some offered condolences, Others avoided eye contact altogether. But none of that mattered to me. All I cared about was Harold standing beside me, finally choosing me over the ghosts of his past. After everyone dispersed, we retreated to the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. We both knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but maybe that was okay. Love isn't supposed to be easy. It's messy, complicated, and sometimes downright painful, but it's worth fighting for. The days following the canceled wedding were a blur of emotions. I felt relief, yes, but also uncertainty. Could we truly rebuild what had been broken? Or was too much damage already done? Harold and I barely spoke those first few days. The weight of everything that had happened hung heavily between us, an invisible barrier neither of us knew how to cross. Finally, one evening, he broke the silence. "Clara," he began hesitantly, "I know I've hurt you in ways I can't undo. But if you'll let me, I want to try to fix this, to make things right again." His voice cracked with emotion, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Still, forgiveness wasn't something I could offer lightly. I needed space, time to process everything and decide whether I could trust him again. So, I packed a small bag and moved into Sarah's spare bedroom for a while. It wasn't easy leaving the home we'd shared for so long, but it was necessary for both of us. Harold visited often, bringing flowers or little notes apologizing for his mistakes. Each gesture tugged at my heartstrings, reminding me of the life we'd built together. Yet, every time I considered returning, doubt crept back in. Was he truly committed to change, or just afraid of being alone? During those quiet nights away from Harold, I found myself reflecting on our marriage. Not just the pain of recent events, but the joy too. Love isn't perfect. It's messy, imperfect, and constantly evolving. I remembered the early days when Harold and I would dance in the kitchen to old records, laughing until our sides ached. I thought about the sacrifices we'd made for each other, moving across the country for his job, supporting each other through illnesses, raising 2 children who grew into wonderful adults. Those memories weren't erased by Maggie's interference. They were still there, woven into the fabric of our lives. But they were overshadowed now by betrayal and mistrust. One afternoon, while sipping tea on Sarah's porch, I called Linda to talk it out. "Love isn't just about passion or excitement," she reminded me gently. "It's about choosing someone day after day, even when it's hard. Even when you don't feel like it." Her words resonated deeply. Maybe Harold and I couldn't go back to the way things were before, but maybe we didn't have to. Maybe we could create something new, stronger than before, built on honesty and mutual effort. That realization gave me hope, and the courage to consider giving Harold another chance. After weeks of separation, Harold and I finally sat down together for a heart-to-heart conversation. It wasn't easy. Tears flowed freely as we unpacked our feelings, but it was cathartic. For the first time, we laid everything bare. We talked about his fears of aging, his regrets over missed opportunities, and his misguided belief that Maggie represented some kind of escape. He admitted he'd been selfish, caught up in nostalgia rather than facing reality. In turn, I shared my own insecurities, the fear that I wasn't enough for him, the pain of feeling betrayed. By the end of the conversation, we were both emotionally drained but lighter somehow, as though shedding years of unspoken tension. To ensure we stayed on track, we decided to attend couples counseling together. At first, it felt awkward sitting in a therapist's office, discussing our problems with a stranger. But slowly, we began opening up, not just to the counselor, but to each other. We learned tools to communicate better, to express our needs without resentment. It wasn't a quick fix. Rebuilding trust took months of patience and effort. But with each session, I felt us growing closer again, rediscovering the bond that had once seemed unbreakable. On the evening of our 46th anniversary, Harold surprised me with a small gathering at our favorite restaurant. Friends and family filled the cozy space, their smiles warm and genuine. As I looked around the room, I realized how far we'd come. It was a bittersweet occasion, tinged with memories of the turmoil we'd endured. But there was also joy, a renewed sense of commitment and gratitude for what we still had. Harold stood up to give a toast, his eyes glistening with tears. 46 years ago, I promised to love Clara for better or worse, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his tone. And though we faced more challenges than I ever imagined, I've never stopped loving her, Not for a single moment. His words brought tears to my eyes, and I reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Later, as we danced to the same song we played at our wedding, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This wasn't the fairy tale ending I dreamed of as a young bride, but it was real, raw, and beautiful in its imperfection. Our love story wasn't over. It was simply entering a new chapter. With the past behind us, Harold and I made a decision to embrace the future, not dwell on regrets. One evening, while flipping through travel brochures, Harold grinned mischievously. "What do you say we finally take that trip around the world?" he suggested. The idea thrilled me. For years, we talked about traveling together, exploring new places and cultures, but life always seemed to get in the way. Now, with nothing holding us back, why not chase that dream? We booked tickets to Europe, planning to visit Paris, Rome, and Barcelona before heading to Asia and beyond. Preparing for the journey reignited a spark in our relationship, reminding us of the adventures we'd yet to experience. As we packed our bags and mapped out our itinerary, I noticed subtle changes in Harold. He laughed more, worried less, and seemed genuinely excited about the road ahead. And me, I felt lighter, freer, as though letting go of the past had opened up new possibilities. Together, we stepped onto the plane hand in hand, ready to write the next chapter of our story, not as victims of circumstance, but as partners determined to cherish every moment. Months later, sitting on a beach in Bali, I pulled out a notebook and began writing a letter to our grandchildren. I wanted them to understand the lessons I'd learned, not just about marriage, but about life itself. I wrote about the importance of communication, of never taking your partner for granted. I shared how forgiveness isn't weakness, it's strength, requiring immense courage and vulnerability. I told them that love isn't static, it evolves, grows, and sometimes falters, but it's worth fighting for. Most importantly, I urged them to prioritize kindness, patience, and understanding in their own relationships. No marriage is perfect, I concluded. But if you're willing to work for it, if you choose each other every single day, you'll find beauty even in the hardest moments. Looking out at the turquoise waves lapping against the shore, I felt a profound sense of contentment. Life hadn't turned out exactly as I'd planned, but then again, maybe that was the point. Sometimes, the most meaningful journeys are the ones we never expected to take. Back home in Portland, life returned to a rhythm of normalcy, but it felt different now, richer somehow. Harold and I approached each day with a newfound appreciation for the little things: morning coffee, evening walks, and quiet conversations under the stars. Our travels had changed us in ways I couldn't have anticipated. We came back with stories to tell, photographs to frame, and memories to last a lifetime. More importantly, we returned with a deeper connection, forged through shared experiences and open hearts. Neighbors often remarked on how happy we seemed, joking that we acted like newlyweds again. And in a way, they were right. We were rediscovering each other, falling in love all over again. Even Maggie occasionally crossed my mind, though not with bitterness anymore. Instead, I pitied her, realizing how lonely she must have been to manipulate others so desperately. Harold and I agreed never to speak of her again, not because we feared reopening old wounds, but because she no longer mattered. Our focus was solely on each other, on building a future filled with laughter, adventure, and unwavering support. On a crisp autumn afternoon, I sat on the porch overlooking the ocean, Harold's hand resting warmly in mine. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly at peace. As I watched the waves crash against the rocks below, I reflected on everything we'd been through. The highs, the lows, and everything in between. Love, I realized, isn't about perfection. It's about resilience, about choosing to stand by someone even when the storms rage fiercest. Harold squeezed my hand gently, pulling me from my thoughts. "Thinking about anything in particular?" he asked with a soft smile. I shook my head, leaning into his shoulder. "Just grateful," I replied simply. Grateful for the life we'd built, the challenges we'd overcome, and the promise of tomorrow. Because in the end, true love isn't about finding someone flawless. It's about embracing their flaws and loving them anyway. And as I sat there beside Harold, I knew without a doubt that we'd found something rare and precious, a love strong enough to weather any storm.